Joining me now, former National Security Advisor and former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton. Sir, thank you for your time this morning. I want to talk about the nuclear threat because it's top of mind. But first of all, your reaction to the president's message yesterday and characterize America's standing in the world given the threats we face.
Well, I think President Biden's rhetoric was very strong yesterday. The trouble is this war in Ukraine continues to grind on, and notwithstanding recent Russian reverses, which have been significant, there's still no path ahead here to either a clear Ukrainian victory or any kind of successful diplomatic resolution. And Putin is still counting on the Europeans to split because of the fear of the economic consequences for them of being cut off from Russian natural gas and other economic constraints. So the rhetoric's fine. I certainly agree with it, but it's not enough to bring the war to what I think the Ukrainians at least see as a successful conclusion. Look, I think the opening week of the UN General Assembly is always a busy time. I don't think it's a good measure of to assess sort of where we are in the world. I think people are worried about the United States' steadfastness in a variety of places, including particularly in Asia, where quite rightly the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February was seen as a failure for the West, a failure of our capacity to deter the attack in the first place. So I think we're in an increasingly dangerous time, and Ukraine is certainly one of the main battlefields at the moment.
Well, and to that point, the U.S. has provided $15 billion so far in aid to Ukraine. It sounds like there will be much more put forth in the months to come. President Biden has said, though, we are not in war with Russia. How does Putin see it?
Well, he doesn't see it that way at all. And since it's American weapons that are killing considerable numbers of Russian soldiers in a good combat conditions test of the efficacy of our weapons, his view is obviously quite different. It's very hard to explain or understand what Russian strategy in this war has been. It's been a real debacle for the Russian armed forces. But notwithstanding that, they still hold more Ukrainian territory than they did on February the 24th. And it's really the status of that territory more than anything else that will determine whether there's any way that this war will be brought to a conclusion in the near term. I honestly don't see what it would be, since Russia at this point has no incentive to stop, as they're actually losing ground at the moment. And Ukraine doesn't have any incentive to stop because 20% or more of their territory is still held by Russia.
Right. And we've seen a lot of momentum from Ukrainian forces with some of these recent wins. You say that we are closer than we have ever been to the threat of nuclear war. I'm curious, do you think that the global population, that Americans and the rest of the world recognizes the nuclear risk?
Well, I think the risk is higher. I don't think it's close at hand. I think if there were a collapse of Russian forces more generally, if they were heading back to the border with Russia, if Ukraine were at a place where they might actually be close to crossing into Russia itself, then I think the risk of Putin resorting to tactical nuclear weapons would be very high. We're not there yet, but we're definitely closer than we were before. I'm afraid part of our problem here is that most of the rest of the world looks at Ukraine and says, that's a war in Europe. It's a long way from us. And while support for sanctions against Russia is widespread in Europe and the United States, it's not so widespread elsewhere in the world. And that's really, to this point, the Russians' economic lifeline, selling oil and gas to other customers rather than Europe, and still at this point making a profit off this war.
I think what ups the ante and what certainly is on the radar of so many is Russia's nuclear capability and any potential targets. What do you see those being?
Well, I don't think at this point it's a serious risk that the Kremlin would use tactical nuclear weapons. And I think if they did, it's entirely possible their first use would be a demonstration somewhere in Ukraine, destroying a large agricultural area rather than a deliberate use in wartime. I do think our president made a mistake yesterday in not making it clear that what our response would be if the Russians did use nuclear weapons, because I think the way to deter Russia from doing this is to state much more clearly what the downside for Russia would be, and that would be real military devastation.
Can you elaborate on that? What would you have liked the president to say more specifically about the U.S. response?
That if Putin used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, he'd be signing a suicide note. This has to be the message to Russia. It's not you can have all the rhetoric and talk about how unacceptable the use of nuclear weapons is, but we have, as I mentioned before, we failed to deter this invasion to begin with. I wouldn't count on our rhetoric being terribly persuasive in deterring future Kremlin actions. And I think if there's any chance this is going to happen, we need to be much more specific about what the consequences would be.
And what's stopping the president from saying so?
Well, I think he's been intimidated by Putin in many respects. We've seen a number of requests, I think perfectly reasonable requests from Ukraine for military assistance, starting with, you'll remember, the Polish MiG fighters that the Ukrainian military had requested that the president has refused, or that have been forthcoming only after months of delay. If Putin wants an excuse to claim we're in the war, he already has it. And I think it's been our reticence and the reticence of many in Western Europe in particular that has given Putin the feeling that we're still not entirely engaged in this, and that there is still a possibility he can split Western Europe and others, perhaps even the United States, away from Ukraine at a critical point.
Well, and in addition to Russia, China is another threat that the United States and the world faces. Before I let you go, you have said that in recent years, many Western foreign policy establishments have been slow to perceive Beijing's threat. Do you include the U.S. in that, and what are the potential consequences if, in fact, the U.S. intervenes in support of Taiwan?
Well, I think we have been slow. I think we're catching up. I think the evidence is in front of us. I think we hear from our friends in Australia and Japan how worried they are. So it's the U.S. is on a fast learning curve. At least I hope that's right. It's not so fast in Europe. I was just in South Korea earlier this week, and I can tell you the people there are fully aware of the threat they see all around them in East Asia, really all along China's periphery. And I think this is something we need to talk about more in the United States, because if we're called upon to meet this challenge, I think it's fair for political leaders to inform the American people about what the nature of the threat is and what we need to do to protect our interests.
Finally, the appeals court in Atlanta this week siding with the DOJ, allowing the investigation into the classified documents seized from former President's Mar-a-Lago home to continue. The president then characterized that last night, the former president saying he doesn't have a process to declassify documents. He can think about declassifying something, and that happens. Your thoughts, and what is the process?
Well, the president has plenary authority. There's no doubt about it, but he has to make the decision manifest. You can't just think about it or simply saying it. Remember that it's not just the particular piece of papers that you see on your screen now that he's declassifying when he says he does it. He declassifies every copy of that document, whether in printed form or electronic form or whatever it may be, all across the government. And the government needs to know that. And even more, it's not simply the physical document that's being declassified, it's the information in the document. And that's why that's so significant, and why the decision, if he's made such a decision, has to be made manifest. And the implications, when he declassifies all these documents, you know, the foreign governments can file Freedom of Information Act requests. So if all these documents really have been declassified, I'm surprised the governments of Russia and China and others haven't made FOIA requests for copies of all these declassified documents, why they're not with their shopping bags outside the archives waiting to get copies of it. This shows the irresponsibility of what President Trump is saying, that he declassified everything he took to his residence. The effect of that on secrets and weapons and sources and methods of gathering intelligence, if he in fact declassified these documents, would be extraordinary.
What are the larger implications in terms of national security risks, given the evidence that we have seen so far?
Well, you know, nobody except the Department of Justice has seen the documents, so we can't say for sure. But the point that they're making is that it's not at all clear there aren't more documents somewhere else. You know, the president left Mar-a-Lago for the summer season. for those who have summer seasons and winter seasons. He left all those documents there. If they were so important to him, you have to ask, did he say take some documents to Bedminster? And what are the storage circumstances for those documents there, or other residences that the president has? The danger here is what the Justice Department said is extremely serious. And I think the Court of Appeals, in its decision last night, reckoned that really was the prerogative of the government to say in the first instance, not the district court. I think the implications of the decision last night really substantially undercut a number of the aspects of the district court's view of this case, even ones that were not part of the decision last night. It was a real sweeping victory for the Department of Justice.
All right, we're going to leave it there. John Bolton, appreciate your time this morning. Thank you. Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.